All right. We're back. Welcome to finally another morning episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. I'm your host, DL, America's most objective libertarian. If you're tuning in live, thank you so much for giving me your time so early. All right. I'm going to need a little bit of help from folks here. I am observing. Uh, so let me back up. I previously was using Rumble to stream. So I would basically send the feed to Rumble. Rumble would send it everywhere else. There were a lot of challenges with that. The biggest challenge was that I literally had to open up multiple windows so that I could monitor the chat because not all of the chats would come into the Rumble, the Rumble UI, right? Like where I have to look at it and see all the chats and everything. And so for that, I found it very difficult because I had to I'd have multiple windows open. I had to do multiple things to ensure that the feed got to the different socials. Now I'm using Restream, and I probably am a day late and $1 short on that. I'm definitely $1 short, but I'm likely a day late because it looks like, to answer your question, that Liberty Lady, that yes, all four platforms, the messages, it looks like they're filtering in now, because I'm seeing messages from YouTube. I'm seeing messages from Rumble. I haven't seen any yet from X, but I can go and throw my own in there. I could just check, just test, put that in there. We'll see what happens. See if that pops up on the screen. Oh, it does. It does. So it looks like Restream is way better. Now I'm still getting used to the controls. So you're going to have to give me like a week, maybe two, to get it all correct. Why is that? Like, DL, you were gone all this time. Why didn't you just practice and, well, I took a sabbatical. If I just did a whole bunch of work, it's not really a sabbatical now, is it? And the reason I took a sabbatical was I just wanted to kind of tighten up family life because it was a lot. There's a lot going on. I have a job. This is not my full-time job. This is what I do kind of for fun, I guess. This is my side gig. Let's put it that way. So this is my side gig. And then I have my regular job. And then I have my family. So it's a wife and a kid and a dog, And so there was a lot going on. And my kid's getting older now. The funny thing about being a parent is that the moment you feel like you've conquered this moment in time with your kid, they just grow into something else, right? So when you start with an infant, you have no idea what you're doing if it's your first one. You have no clue. You can read everything that you want. You can be told everything you want. But until you get into it, you have no idea what you're doing. And you have no idea how you're going to respond and all. And so that was, the first couple of months, I always tell people, I'm like, it was just raw survival. We both were sleep deprived. We're like, walking around like zombies. And so then as he gets out of infant stage, then he's got new things. And so you're just trying to, and so now he's like 6. He's getting ready to be 7. And yes, I think I've lasted longer than parents. But yes, I am tired of 6, 7. I'm tired of it. And it's the way, because it's not just like every now and then he's like 6, 7. He's like, Dad, what's 6 plus 7? And I'm like, and you're like 13. He's like, nope. He's like got jokes now. This kid has jokes. So anyway, to get back to what I was trying to tell you, you have all these life changes that are occurring, and you're trying to balance them. And so I needed a sabbatical to kind of just reimagine my time and my schedule and how I want to do things so that I can keep up with it. Because now that he's 6, as I was getting ready to say, he's now into things. Like, when he was an infant, he just needed like burping and bottles, diaper change, hugs, and then naps. It's pretty simple. Now it's complicated because he's like, he's got like Cub Scouts and he's got robotics, and he's got all these different things. He's got school, he's got all these things that he has places he has to be. And so then we've got to work that into the schedule. We got to figure out, right, who's taking him. And we have a pretty good schedule. So anyway, I took a sabbatical to kind of take a break and just lighten my load. Because here's the thing about doing a podcast, especially a political podcast, you need to keep up with events in some way. And one of the ways that I was doing it was to just get on social media, go through, argue with people, talk about things, read some more, and read some more again, read news articles, read court documents, whatever I need to, And so I was trying to, in some way, keep up with the Joneses. Like, oh, this event happened on Monday. I'm going to try to talk about it on Tuesday or Wednesday. We're going to get away from that. Not entirely, but a lot. And I don't know exactly to what degree, but I am going to get away from it because this is not my full-time job just yet. Now, if you guys help me grow this channel and it blows up and it becomes my full-time job, well, then, yeah, we can reevaluate and see, what makes sense in light of that. But for the time being, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start being a little bit more delayed in some of the topics. Now if something happens like on a Friday, I might have the weekend to talk about it and be ready on Monday. But if something happens on Wednesday, I may not talk about it this week, that week. I may talk about it the following week. And that gives me a little bit better ability to not have to dive in and try to consume all of this information so that I'm ready the next morning, which means I might delay other tasks. So I'm just kind of, so my sabbatical was more about, one, getting a break, and then two, just thinking and kind of mentally reevaluating things and saying, all right, what makes sense? What does not make sense? That's what it was about. So you're not going to see a whole lot of changes right now. However, you might see some errors as we go along as I'm working out the new platform that I'm using, Restream, and I work out all the controls. So, for instance, right now, I'm not even sure how to get a specific comment up on the screen. So, once I figure that out, I'll let you know. So, we are moving along. The fight continues. And speaking of, hey, what if something happens, and I have the weekend to talk about it? Well, here we are. We're going to talk about the Maduro takedown. I'm doing something I think is a little on the unique side. From what I've been observing on social media, it looks like people are basically diving into one element and either criticizing or defending. Right? They're like, oh, you can't do this, because Trump bad or MAGA this or that. And there's reason to have these, like it makes sense on social media. But for a show, I wanted to do something a little different. So what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of give you, as objective as I can, a bit of a lay of the land, like a little bit of history, a little bit of legal, a little bit of commentary. And what I want you to get from this show today is I want you to walk away, hopefully, with a little bit more knowledge about this whole thing, as best as we can, in less than an hour. Because if I were to go fully in depth, it would be like 1 hour every day for like 5 days or 2 weeks or something like that. Like, there's a lot. There's absolutely. So I have tried my best to distill this down as much as possible. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to go over, and I've got eight broad points, 8 broad areas that we're going to just kind of go through. I'm not going to go in depth, right? I'm kind of getting tongue-tied. I'm going to kind of give you an overview. So I'm going to start with the 2020 DOJ indictment. Then we're going to talk about the 2019 non-recognition of Maduro's leadership. Then after that, we're going to get into the 2025 escalations, right? This is where we're bombing boats and whatnot. And then we'll talk about the 2025 kinetic pressure buildup, because they want to call it kinetic. They don't want to talk about like this is a military strike. No, this was kinetic action, right? They love using, they meaning government, loves using language to obscure stuff or make it sound better. It's kind of like when you say, you know what, I'm not a stock boy. I'm a shelf replenishing engineer. Oh, okay. That sounds way cooler, doesn't it? That's basically what they're basically using language to make it sound better. You know, I think George Carlin did a bit where he was talking about like how it used to be called like shell shock, and then it basically ended up becoming PTSD, and just how we changed the name of soldiers who came back and were mentally scarred from the war, and we basically went from a more direct language that we could look at and say, yeah, this is bad, to something more abstract. So that's just the way of the world. You can't get past that. All right. So then then we'll go to an intermission, and then after that we will talk about the capture operation on January 3rd. Then we'll talk about some Noriega parallels. Yeah, a lot of people are talking about Noriega. Legal flashpoints. So we'll talk about the War Powers Act briefly, Kerr Frisbee, standing issues, stuff like that. Then we will finally we'll end it with the aftermath and just kind of tell you like where we are now. So all I want to do is just kind of give you an overview, because as you know, when this first happened, I focused more on domestic policy, generally speaking, and so there were a lot of things that I wasn't familiar with. And so I did a bunch of research, and I was like, okay, if I needed to know some of this information, perhaps people in my audience might benefit from knowing this information. So that's what I'm doing. All right. And now I'm a libertarian, and I object to almost all of U.S. intervention, right? Like if it doesn't affect us directly, it's almost 100% guarantee that I will oppose it. You know, I'm leaving the door open just a crack, just in case there's some weird situation that I haven't thought of. But generally speaking, I'm going to oppose our intervention in other countries, our engagement with other countries when it's not directly affecting us. Okay, and we'll talk about that too, because a lot of people are making the arguments. They're like, oh, well, this does affect us. We'll talk about that. But generally speaking, I will oppose these things. I think that we should pull all of our troops back and stay the hell out of other countries, plain and simple. So let's get into this. And if for some reason along the way I figure out how to put comments up on the screen, I will totally do that. But for now, it is what it is. So let's start with this. We're going to talk about the 2020 DOJ indictment. In March 2020, the United States Department of Justice, they unsealed historic charges against the sitting Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, for narco-terrorism conspiracy. They accused him of leading the cartel of Suns in order to flood the United States with cocaine in partnership with Colombian FARC guerrillas. Okay? So that was the accusation. Now, there's a 25-page document that is now been that has been released by I think if you go find Pam Bondi on X, she provides a direct link to that, and maybe I'll throw it into the show notes after the show. I've read part of the indictment against him. It's like 25 pages. I probably read like, I don't know, the first page. And I was really tired, okay? Like I made the mistake of going to bed, and I was like, oh, I see this. And I was like, oh, I'll just start reading it. And then I started reading it, and I got tired, and then I just didn't get back to it. So apologies. But that's okay. It's not going to hurt the show. But it's out there for you to read. Now, the one interesting thing that other people have said about it is that it says nothing about fentanyl. Okay, so just keep that in the back of your mind. All right, so then this indictment, it really did kind of mark the first time that a foreign head of state faced U.S. drug trafficking charges while in office, and they basically framed him as this criminal enterprise rather than a legitimate government. That's going to come into play later when we talk about sovereignty, okay? And so this $15 million bounty was immediately offered for information leading to his arrest, kind of signaling that the U.S. would treat outstanding warrants as enforceable regardless of diplomatic status. Now, let's get on to the next point. So that's basically a high-level overview. Again, that's all we're doing because we don't have much time, of the indictment, okay? And the indictment comes off of the non-recognition of his leadership. So his re-election in 2018 was highly disputed. And the U.S. in January of 2019, they declared him illegitimate, and they actually recognized the opposition leader, Juan Guaido. I'm not sure how you say it. I should have looked that up. As the interim president, isolating the regime diplomatically. Okay, so the U.S. was just like, yeah, you're not the real guy. Now, why does that matter? In the context of what we're talking about, it matters because heads of state generally get diplomatic immunity. You can't, like, the U.S. can't just go arrest a diplomat. Like, that's how it works. And so, in order for that to happen, they would have to first say, yeah, you're not legitimate. And this policy, it shifted and it enabled the aggressive maximum pressure of the sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector and officials. And this had a crippling effect on the economy, and it framed Maduro as a usurper who did not have sovereign protections, right? Like I said, you get those protections if you are a head of state. They basically took them away, or they basically removed the foundation that would provide them. And it also set the precedent up. It basically set the U.S. up so that they could act against Maduro as a private criminal defendant and not, like I said, the protected head of state. And so it kind of laid the groundwork. It said, all right, maybe they had intentioned at some point to take, physical action against him, or maybe they were just going to continue with sanctions. So this happened during Trump's first presidency. Then you have the Biden administration. And the Biden administration, they basically used legal tools, sanctions and things like that, to try to put pressure on Venezuela and Maduro. Clearly, that did not work because he lasted all throughout Biden's term. Now, there's a document out there. It was like the Biden administration. They had a report to Congress, and they explicitly said, and I'm not quoting it because I don't have it in front of me, but they explicitly said in that document that they had no intentions of any regime changes for any country. So it was more broad. And so it didn't specifically specify Venezuela, but you can draw the conclusion from that document and from the actions of the Biden administration that they had zero intention ever at any point of physically going and trying to arrest him, even though that groundwork was kind of laid for them. They were just like, all right, we're just going to use sanctions, and we're going to use these legal maneuvers instead. Okay, I figured that was important because you've got the Trump administration, then you roll over to the Biden administration, and now we're back to the Trump administration, who, of course, went in and captured him, or as I would prefer to say, kidnapped. We'll get to that. 2025, the escalations now. So the bounty on Maduro, it rose from 15 million in 2020 to 25 million. Actually, during Biden in January, in the late Biden era, in January of 2025, and then it increased in August of 2025 to 50 million. Okay, and this was under Trump. So we escalated this commitment toward dealing with him, because we're like, all right, it starts out at 15 million. Now we're going to give you 25 million, and then now we're going to give you 50 million. And I didn't think to look it up, but I wonder if anybody tried to cash in on that bounty, because it's kind of weird that we would put a bounty out when the U.S. has been credibly accused of interfering with elections and other heads of state in the past, right? Like, if we were just going to send in our troops to go get him, like, who gets the bounty? Or does the bounty just signal what our intentions are? Do they just say, hey, 15 million is pretty serious. 25 million is getting more serious. 50 million, we're ultra super duper serious. It's basically the triple dog dare, okay, of politics. So then in early 2025, the administration, they designated the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, which was tied to the regime, and MS-13 as foreign terrorist organizations. And that links Maduro's government now to transnational terrorism. So I think this part is interesting because when that happened, the conversation seemed to really, if I remember correctly, on social media and just things that I was reading from the news and hearing from elected leaders, the conversation was really like, well, we have Tren de Aragua here in Colorado and they're taking over apartment complexes. We need to designate them as terrorist organizations so that we can remove them, which was kind of weird because it was like, well, it was weird because, one, if they're here illegally, then you already have grounds to remove them, for starters. And then if they're committing violent crime, that seems to pretty much seal the deal. Like, there's not a whole lot to argue if you snatch up some people out of Colorado who have been taken over and you have evidence that they literally took over by force an apartment complex. I don't know too many Americans that are going to be like, nah, we should probably give, we should probably, allow them to stay. They're like, nobody's going to say they're one of the good ones, right? So that's kind of interesting. But what I think is more interesting is we were presented with this notion that, hey, we've got to designate them as terrorist organization because we got to get them out of our country. And now looking back, I'm like, well, maybe the real reason was to bolster what they would actually end up doing, which is going and kidnapping him and then bringing him to New York so they could try him in American courts. All right? So I think that's kind of interesting because we kind of were under the impression that this had to be done because they were in our country and we needed to deal with them. And we've not heard any fanfare from the government about, like, here's all these known Tren de Aragua members and here's all the evidence to show for it that they indeed are Tren de Aragua and that they indeed are taking over apartment complexes and committing all these violent crimes. We didn't really get that. So now I look back and I'm like, maybe it had really, maybe the United States government, the federal government, did not actually designate them as terrorists for any reason related to what was happening in Colorado or elsewhere. Perhaps that was more of a cover story to keep the lid on, hey, eventually we're going to go get this guy. I'm just saying, I like transparency, and it seems like that wasn't happening. And then these moves, they reframe now Venezuela, the whole country, as a narco-terrorist threat to the United States, which, they throw under national security, and then they can justify military options, however they try to do. And my opinion, if you're the listener of this show, if you're a regular audience member, that I think that national security is something that the United States government uses on the regular, right? Like, they're just like, national security, and you're like, oh, how convenient. Either national security or interstate commerce. Like, they love those. Like, if it weren't for those two doctrines, if you will, if it weren't for them, like, the federal government would be quite limited on what they could actually do. So that's your 2025 escalation. Of course, after all that, then we started bombing the boats. There was a lot of argument about the boats. And I will point this out. I will say that there were a lot of arguments that just weren't good arguments on both sides. One of the, in the opposition side, one of the arguments was like, oh, they're just fishing boats. Well, these were clearly speedboats. They were not fishing boats. The real question that I don't think ever got answered was who was driving these boats. And of course, we can't answer that because we blew them up and we killed them, right? Extrajudicial killings. And the real problem there is there was some question about whether or not people were being forced to drive these boats wherever they were going. They were not going to the United States. People figured that out. They said, look, the distance from Venezuela to the United States is too far for a speedboat to make it. They're going in a different direction. So there were all these arguments that said, yeah, it doesn't really seem like they're a direct threat to the United States. Perhaps they were going to another country and they were going to bounce around, and fine, make that argument, show us the evidence. But the argument that they were a direct threat, these particular boats, wasn't there. And furthermore, we didn't really get who was driving these boats. Were these Tren de Aragua members who you could argue and say, yeah, these were narco terrorists because they're actually part of this Venezuelan gang who is known to be a violent gang? Or did they use, did they use basically, did they force people to be drug mules? My speculation is the latter, but I don't have a lot of evidence because they killed him. So then we get to this 2025 kinetic pressure buildup. I guess I kind of jumped the gun on that. So that's where we start seeing this increased military presence in the Caribbean with additional naval assets. We've got surveillance flights. We've got joint exercises with Colombia and Guyana. We're framing this as a counter narcotics and anti-terror operations against, Venezuela. We've got to do all these things. We make strikes on the drug running boats, some coastal facilities. There was at least 8 interdictions that destroyed vessels allegedly tied to the cartel of the Suns. Okay, administration officials repeatedly described the Maduro regime as an active narco-terrorist threat to the United States homeland security. They cited Tren de Aragua's expanding presence in American cities as this justification, right? So everything I just said. And so, again, I go back to perhaps this presence in the United States was used to their advantage. Now, if you really want to get conspiratorial, since we are talking about the Trump administration, since we are talking about MAGA, who has been conspiratorial, like they were like, oh, the 2020 election was stolen, and oh, the Biden administration brought in all these immigrants, right? Remember that? I haven't forgotten that yet. So what if, this is pretty conspiratorial, I'm assuming, what if it was the U.S.'s position that we wanted to remove Maduro, but we had to lay the groundwork in order for that to happen? So what if the United States itself allowed these people to come in so they would be present, so that we could say, oh, look at all these illegals here that are doing bad things. We need to do something about it. American public, here's what we're going to tell you. And we're going to blame it on the Biden administration. But perhaps it was a lot more coordinated than either side would actually like to admit. And the reason I say that is not because I really want to get into conspiratorial ideas. I'm not a big fan of conspiracy theories because generally they rely on, I have a question, it's not been answered, therefore it must be true. I don't really get into that. I prefer actual information, actual evidence. But I think it's worth, since everybody likes doing it, I think it's worth adding this one to the mix and saying, what if the position of the United States was, we're going to remove Maduro for whatever purpose, and in order to do that, we've got to lay the groundwork. And part of that groundwork was like, all right, Biden, you got elected, you have to allow these people in. We're going to blame it on you, and then we're going to move on, then we're going to do our thing. And you're going to say, no, we didn't, right? And you might say, well, Dale, that seems kind of nefarious. I mean, we are talking about the U.S. government. I mean, the U.S. government has done nefarious things. And I do find it interesting that the 2020 election, there was a lot of complaints about what happened. And so perhaps, now, let me back up a little bit. I'm not saying everything happened explicitly just so they could remove Maduro. That seems like it'd be a lot. Like to have, a whole president come in so that he could be the bad guy and then Trump could be the good guy. But since a lot of people want to say the 2020 election was stolen and it's questionable whether it actually was, then I think it's fair to continue on and say, what if it really wasn't stolen? What if a lot of that was done on purpose so that it would look stolen and that we could get a guy in that we could blame things on? I mean, have you heard anything from Biden lately? No. Why? Because he's so old and he's like basically on his deathbed. And we saw it during his administration. we saw that the man would like walk off stage and walk to the left, and then somebody would go over and grab him and turn him around and be like, "No, you got to go this way." So I'm just saying, if we're going to get in conspiracies, put it all on the table. Perhaps Trump is part of that conspiracy. I don't know. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for either one of them. So, so that's the first 4 parts. Just kind of laying the groundwork, telling you what's going on. Some of that you probably already know. Hopefully some of that is new information to you, But I think it's very interesting to note that in 2019, we started this path, and then in 2025 or 2026, we are now here. And so it just strikes me as if this situation lasted for so long, then perhaps there's a lot more coordination going on than we're talking about. And I think that's reasonable. So tell me what you guys think. I'm not seeing anything in the chats here. Give me just a second here, and I will double check. Let's see, where's that? Yeah, that one's fine. All right, so let's see. Yeah, I know, like that Liberty Lady's like got a emoji with the head exploding, and like, yeah, I know, like, could that be real? I don't know, right? Do I think the government's being transparent with us? Absolutely not. They are not. So since they are not, that means I have to wonder about what they might not be telling us. The only thing is, when you wonder, when you start speculating, try not to drift too far. You know what I'm saying? Like, let me frame that in a different context, so maybe it'll make more sense. Imagine my wife is like, "Hey, I'm gonna run to the store really quickly. I just want to pick up some spaghetti." I'm just making stuff up. And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And like, the store is just a few minutes around the corner. And let's say it takes her like 40 minutes, which would be a kind of a long time if you're just going to go to the store around the corner from us and pick up, some spaghetti. And then she comes back, and let's say I text her and I'm like, "Hey, you all right over there?" And she's like, "Yeah, I'm just checking out some deals or whatever. I'm looking at some of these BOGO items and trying to decide if I want to buy stuff." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And then I might say, "Well, that seems kind of weird, like 40 minutes, like how long is it, And so then I might start speculating. Now I could leap and I could jump and I could say, "Well, I bet she's talking to some other man," right? Like, that's a huge leap, especially if there's no other evidence to support it. So ultimately I'm making this example so that to kind of help you understand that when you dive into conspiracy, when you consider a conspiracy theory, try to consider the ones that are closest to what you have evidence for, right? And maybe that wasn't a good example. I just did it off the cuff, but whatever. The government is never transparent with us, especially when they tell us they're being transparent, says that Liberty Lady. Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. Like, they're never transparent. Even when they say they are, they're not. They're lying. Let me check some other socials here. I don't see anything else, so that's good. So I'm gonna go to intermission. We'll come back. We'll talk about the other half. We'll talk about the capture. We'll talk about Noriega, how he fits in. We'll talk about some legal flashpoints. That's the part I hope that you'll find the most interesting. And then we will kind of discuss like some aftermath and kind of maybe what we might expect. So we'll be right back, and stay tuned.
The day I got cited, I was blindsided.
I couldn't believe that I was in America. I left a place where that stuff happens, but not here. Here, this is the land of opportunity.
I didn't do anything wrong.
I just couldn't believe it. I didn't do anything wrong.
You think that you're doing things the right way. You think that you're a law-abiding citizen.
And they said I was under arrest for braiding hair, and they took me to jail.
They seized a little over $100,000 out of my business account here. Took 13 years to get it, and less than 13 seconds, I guess, to take it away.
I remember my attorneys telling me, most people don't win against the government.
Because I know now that we have more than just a chance. I know that we're going to keep our homes.
If we win here at the U.S. Supreme Court, it makes a difference for my girls and for so many other families.
I'm fighting back because I don't want to have a lot of other people have to go through the same thing I'm going through with their property getting seized.
We changed the law so that everybody else can be treated fairly.
I want the opportunity
to operate my legal business,
to practice my craft,
to meet the needs of my community in an innovative way.
And someone has to stand up.
All right, we're back. Love the guys over at the Institute for Justice. They do a lot of awesome work. Their job is basically to sue the U.S. government when the U.S. government has wronged individuals. And unfortunately, they make a living of it. I mean, that's fortunate for them. Unfortunate that it happens so often that they can make a living off of it. So there's that. But go ahead and give them a follow if you are on social media and you see them. Great guys. I follow several of the actual lawyers as well. They got some great takes on legal matters that I love following. All right, so let's get back into this. Let us now move over to, call this like Maduro Part 2 now. We're going to talk about the capture operation. So this was a pre-dawn raid, and it started about 2 a.m. That makes sense, right? Local time, not our time. Local time in Caracas. And so that makes sense because you get the element of surprise. And they had over 150 U.S. aircraft launched from bases across the hemisphere to suppress Venezuelan air defenses. At the same time, elite Delta Force operators, they basically descended on Maduro's compound in Puerto Tijuana, I think I said. And they extracted him and his wife, Celia Flores, with pretty much no resistance, okay? He was taken into custody without a fight. Officials described it as, quote, giving up after being caught by surprise. Then they were flown by helicopter to the USS Iwo Jima in the Caribbean and then eventually transferred to New York. So they're now in federal custody in Brooklyn, and that all happened by Saturday evening so that they could face their narco-terrorism and drug charges. President Trump, now when I say like, hey, the government's not being forthright, President Trump personally approved the operation on Friday night, it's January 2nd, after months of rehearsals and CIA intelligence gatherings. Okay? Months of rehearsals. Now, as what I pointed out, Congress was not told about this. Nobody in Congress was told about this. Now, on some level, you might say, well, that makes sense. If you're going to go do an operation like this, should you tell a lot of people? No, you should not. Right? Like in general, like speaking from a strategic point of view, you should not. From a transparency's point of view, we're going to get to that in just a moment. I think you should absolutely find somebody in Congress that you can tell and say, hey, this is going to happen. I mean, I do understand the idea that if you're planning to go and capture a leader of the whole country, whether you see him as legitimate or not, I understand that you need the element of surprise. If they announced on CNN and said, or if Trump got on Truth Social and was like, this weekend we're going to go capture Maduro, Maduro's going to be like, what? No. And he's going to be gone. You're not going to find him. Okay? So I understand from a strategic point of view that you need to keep this hush-hush. I also have problems with the issue of, did my video freeze? Let me know if my video freeze. I don't know. Seems like my video froze. We'll keep going. I don't know if the video froze. It's looking like it's froze here, but we'll deal with it. Anyway, so I understand that if you that you want you want the element of surprise, but I also recognize that we have something called the United States Constitution, and that's kind of an important document that you're supposed to follow. Our government doesn't really do so good at following it. Anyway, So they had months of rehearsals, and if you dig into the details, there's like a CNN article that you can read where officials, told them some of the details. Basically, they set up a compound that looked exactly, that was designed exactly like Maduro's compound, and they basically practiced, flying in, dropping down, snatching them up, getting the heck out of there. Now, from a military perspective, this okay, video looks fine. Okay, it must be on mine. Thank you for that. So from a military perspective, this was amazing. Okay? And what I'm separating here is whether they should have done it versus, okay, how did you do it? And from the details that I was able to read, this was an amazing operation. And I will say, to a very limited extent, kudos to the military for such a flawless execution of this. Okay? Now, that's separate from me thinking that you should have done it. And look, I understand that, like, the United States military, they regularly tell their soldiers, hey, if it's an unlawful order, you are expected to refuse it and stuff like that. The likelihood that this was all going to be refused is pretty low. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. We'll talk about the standing when we get to the legal portion of this. And I'm not going to make an argument per se that our military should refuse the order, because if somebody says, shoot this innocent civilian, you refuse that order, it's 100% clear cut that that is an illegal order. If you're a member of the military, when you've got all these politics and legal issues at play, it's not as clear to you, because our soldiers are soldiers. They're not JAG officers. So I think we have to be careful to not necessarily point the finger at our soldiers and say, you should have known better, because they're going to have to try to figure out all of the nitty-gritty details, like the War Powers Act. Does that come into play? Is this a legitimate use of the executive power? So on. And it's one thing for me to sit and I don't want to say grandstand, but I guess for lack of a better word, to grandstand, to run my mouth, to yap about it to an audience and say, hey, this was illegal, you were wrong, blah, blah, blah. That's one thing, because I can say whatever I damn well please on my podcast. And whatever, I could be wrong about it, that's fine. No harm, no foul to me. But if I'm a member of the military and I'm given an order, I have to really, really be sure this is an illegal order, because I could go to jail for the rest of my life. I could be brought up on charges under the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I could end up going to Fort Leavenworth forever, depending on the nature of it, right? Like if you were a leak, if you leaked the information out and you said, hey, this is going to happen, I'm refusing this order, and I want to let everybody know, now you might have jeopardized your fellow soldiers, you might have compromised the whole mission, and you could be in some serious trouble. You could end up going to jail for a really, really long time. So you need to know for sure that it's an illegal order. So again, I'm just going to say the distinction between shoot this innocent civilian is far different than, hey, we don't have the legal authority to go in and capture this dude, even though, as I just pointed out, that the government spent years laying the groundwork that would eventually lead up to this mission, whether that was the intention or not, right? So they have all this groundwork laid. So if you're a regular soldier and you're like, well, in 2019, they determined that he wasn't even the legitimate president. And then in 2020, they put a bounty on his head. And then they designated Tren de Aragua as, narco-terrorist and MS-13. And they've just laid all these legal foundations. I'm gonna be honest with you. I think for a soldier, that's not really their decision to make anymore. Like they could say, hey, I need, the public needs to know about this. I need to refuse this order. But honestly, that is an awful lot of information to try to sift through and to try to figure out. And if you have no experience in law, like, I'm not going to begrudge you for not following that order. I'm really not. And I know this may, some of my libertarian peers may take issue with that. You'll just have to get over it. Because at the end of the day, I think we need to really, this is really more of what the courts might call a political question, right? Like in terms of legality, like not legality in like you just casually saying that was illegal. I mean, in terms of what you can prove and demonstrate under our current system, I think this ends up being more of a political question. And, and perhaps a legal question too, like, what was the legal foundation? Do you have the authority to do this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? But I just don't think that's something that we should hold our soldiers account. So from a military perspective, from a strategic perspective, I think, man, this was pretty phenomenal how they did it. There were limited casualties. My position, one casualty is one too many. But we already know that when you go bombing places, there are people that are not always combatants that are in that are present. So all things being considered, I think it was a pretty spectacular demonstration of what the military is capable of, even though I actually oppose them having done it in the first place. And at the same time, I would say I'm not going to begrudge my fellow, not my fellow soldiers because I'm no longer in the military, but my fellow countrymen, the soldiers that that are active duty, for not refusing this order. That's where I stand, and I get it. Some of my peers may be upset. That's fine. You'll get over it. You'll sleep fine just tonight. You'll sleep just fine. Moving on. Let's talk about some Noriega parallels. So a lot of people point out like, oh, well, we did this with Noriega. So let me just say, just because we did something once does not make doing it again legitimate. It's not how that works, right? Now, there is precedent, and precedent does go in favor of, hey, this must be legal because we did it. But that's not always the case. Like, just because I steal from the store and don't get caught doesn't mean it was okay, right? Or just because I stole from the store and the store did catch me and they just said, please don't do that again, which they wouldn't do, but like, assume they did. They just said, hey, please don't do that again. We don't like that. That doesn't make it okay, right? Because I didn't get punished for it. That just means it happened, and there either somebody didn't make a good argument, or perhaps we have a corrupt system, right? Maybe we had some corrupt people. So Nicolas Maduro faced U.S. indictments for drug trafficking and narcoterrorism while serving as a de facto leader. Okay, the U.S., they refused to recognize his administration's legitimacy. And this was because Noriega avoided elections, and then Maduro did so after 2018, 2024. He engaged in some fraud. So then the United States, they used military force to enforce arrest warrants. The 1989-1990 Panama operation called Just Cause, that involved a full-scale invasion with 27,000 U.S. troops to remove Noriega after he declared a state of war with the United States. Now, I talked about it in a past episode last year, how just because another country says we're at war with the U.S., that does not mean the U.S. is necessarily at war. And we have historical precedent for that. So everybody that likes to point to, hey, Panama, right, Noriega, and this happened, we got precedent. Well, I'm pointing to precedent early on in our country. We talked about this with the Barbary Pirates, where the Barbary Pirates were attacking merchant ships, and we initially did not do anything. They were basically, at war with us in a sense, and we did nothing for like, what was it, like a year or two? It was a significant amount of time. Okay, so for me, I look at it and say, okay, just because you've declared war doesn't mean we're at war. Our Congress still has to declare war. Because imagine Chile. Chile seems like a pretty small country comparatively, especially with the military and whatnot. Imagine Chile says, we're at war with the United States. Okay, what does that mean? Like, are you directly attacking us? Like, because they could say they're at war with us and not be attacking us, and so there's really nothing happening. They could not declare war and attack us, right, as more like the Barbary Pirates did. So there's these variations. So at the end of the day, The U.S. is at war with a country when and only when Congress declares war. Period. Okay, but yes, Noriega declared state of war with the United States. Contrasting to that, the 2026 Maduro raid was actually a limited surgical strike with no ground occupation, relying on air suppression and elite extraction teams, Delta Force. So vastly different in their approach. And I would argue, if, this is where I might get in trouble, but just bear with me, if the U.S. is going to remove a head of state, that's a big if because I oppose this. But if they're going to do it, a surgical strike is the appropriate way. We should not be sending in 27,000 U.S. troops to go after one guy in a country that we probably have many other options for. Okay? Now, the outcomes, they aligned in successfully capturing the target for the United States for trial. Okay, so Noriega, he was convicted in 1992, and he served 17 years for his crimes. Okay? And I put them in air quotes because I'm really skeptical of this idea that we can charge a foreign citizen with a crime and then bring them over here. And maybe some crimes, like if they came over to the U.S. and they committed a crime and then went back home, that would make more sense. But if they're over there in their country, well, and they're just like, hey, we're going to sell some drugs. Well, you know my position on the drug war. I think it's long since failed before it started. Okay? But it just strikes me as a bit odd for the U.S. to be able to go and just say, well, we're going to capture you, bring you here, and then try you in a court of law with basically all of the same privileges and rights as we would try anybody else. I don't know if you know this, but you can have a jury trial unless you're being tried by the military. So if you're being tried in a military tribunal court, then you don't get a jury of peers. But you can have a jury like Maduro can expect a jury because he's going to be tried in a civilian court, which I think is kind of humorous, because you've got MAGA who is all like, rah, 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 we did this. So at least like half of them are like, rah, 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 we did this. He was a bad dude, and he was. And then the Venezuelans are happy now. We should do all this stuff. And, but they're at the same time like, well, foreigners don't get any rights. But they're not going to argue with the rights that Maduro is going to get. They're not going to be butthurt because Maduro got a jury to be accountable to. Right? So I just think it's kind of interesting. The other problem, the other distinction between Panama and this is Panama saw hundreds of deaths and a prolonged U.S. presence. So again, the Maduro operation was designed to minimize casualties and avoid nation building. So in that particular sense, that's a good thing. Okay, so now you have a little bit of like the parallel with, because a lot of people are pointing to Noriega. But again, I will point out, just because it happened, just because it went through, and maybe, and if you look through the details, you'll find that Noriega tried to challenge it in court, and the challenges failed, and that leads us to the legal flashpoints, which we'll get to in just a moment here. But just a second, let me finish this thought here. So there are some parallels, but in another sense, it was also vastly different in how it was executed, and I think it was vastly better. So again, if we're going to do this, surgical is definitely preferred, though I would argue in the first place, you do not have the authority to do this. And I would argue not even in a non-extradition country. So if you have, and I would especially argue that if it's a country that has an extradition policy with the United States, and then you go in, you just snatch somebody, then I would argue that's even worse of a violation, because you have an agreement for that country to say, under these circumstances, we will hand over a citizen to the United States for trial, right? And so at least in that sense, their own country has said, we have a legal process under which this happens. Because at the end of the day, we have countries that have laws they should be not relative, they should be transparent laws. The citizens of each respective country should say, we like that law, or we don't like that law, we're going to do something about it. And then they should know if something happens, here is the outcome that they can expect. If you're in an extradition country that has an extradition treaty with the United States, you should expect that if you commit a crime worthy for the United States to ask them, hey, will you extradite this person to our country? You should expect that if they have that principle, that doctrine, that it might actually happen. But if there is no extradition treaty, then you should expect that the U.S. can only grab you if you're maybe in international waters, right, where there's no specific authority, or if you come into the U.S. territory. That would be an example of abiding by the law. Our governments must abide by the law. We can't just say, hey, you can't traffic drugs, but if you do, we're just going to pull some stunts and we'll snatch you up. Like it doesn't work in our country. If the police kick in the door right now with no warrant, come upstairs and interrupt me in the middle of my stream and arrest me and don't read me my rights, I will go free because they committed a lot of violations of the law for which I expected to be followed. So I expect our governments, our government at least, I have the expectation of other governments, but I can't enforce it. I expect all governments to follow their own laws and the citizens to be aware of what the laws are. Otherwise, what's the point? What's the point in talking about, oh, you're not a law-abiding citizen? Why not? The government isn't. Why should I? All right. So now let's see, where did my notes go? Oh, yeah. Okay. So now let's move on to some of the legal flashpoints here, because I think this is where it gets kind of interesting. The Trump administration, they argued that the raid does not trigger the War Powers Resolution 60-day clock because it was a limited law enforcement action to enforce a valid 2020 federal indictment, that they were not, quote, introducing, it was not, quote, an introduction of U.S. forces into hostilities, which would require congressional approval. And they cited historical precedents like drone strikes, which I oppose, and bin Laden's 2011 killing, which I believe I oppose. If that one I'm a little bit, I didn't refresh my memory, but I want to say that we did have the cooperation of the country, but we might not have. If we didn't, then it was wrong. So again, I expect us to follow the law. But I would have to go and look at the details to remember specifically. Apologies for that. But what I want to get into is I want to get into this War Powers Act, because a lot of people were quoting the War Powers Act. They're like, oh, it's a war. Like, people would quote two things. They would quote the 2001 AUMF that Congress gave George Bush so that he can go fight terrorism. Now, in that one's out automatically. I don't know why people keep referring to it, because if you actually go and read it, you will find that it explicitly says that the authority that Congress gave was to root out terrorists that were directly responsible for 9/11. So this wasn't like, it wasn't like, oh, you can go get some terrorists. It was, you can go get terrorists who were responsible for this action. That's what you were allowed. All right. So I want to pull up on the screen for you something that Justin Amash, he is a former Congress member, and he is a libertarian Republican, if you will. And he was a member of Congress from 2011 to 2021. Okay. So what I want to read to you something. I'm going to put up on the screen for you because I'm just that nice of a guy. Let's see here. Yeah, let's do this really quickly. Why does it seem to have changed size on me? That's okay. There we go. All right. Make that a little bigger. There we go. Okay. Boom. There it is. Now it's on the screen. All right. So he says, I'm reading from his, because it's kind of long, and I didn't want to butcher it. I didn't want to get it wrong. So I'm just going to read it directly. One of the most frequently misrepresented federal statutes, often falsely used to justify unconstitutional presidential war powers, is the War Powers Resolution. If only more people would read it. contrary to what you might have heard about the War Powers Resolution, it does not allow the president to take military action for any reason for 60 to 90 days without congressional approval, so long as the president notifies Congress within 48 hours. Section 1541 of the War Powers Resolution states clearly, now we're quoting the War Powers Resolution, the constitutional powers of the president as commander-in-chief to introduce United States Armed Forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances are exercised only pursuant to 1, a declaration of war. Remember, that's Congress. 2, specific statutory authorization. That would be your AUMF. Or 3, a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories, or possessions, or its armed forces. That's the end of the quote from the War Powers Resolution. Justin Amash goes on to say, of the 3 cited authorities, not one indicates a presidential power to take unilateral, that's without Congress's approval, offensive military action. The first 2 authorities allow the president to take offensive military action, but only with Congress's express approval. That's Article 1 of the Constitution that grants Congress the exclusive power to declare war. The third authority allows the president to take defensive military action, defensive, without Congress's approval in the event of a specific type of national emergency, a sudden, unforeseen attack on the United States that's happening too quickly for Congress to meet, and that would necessitate immediate action to protect Americans. It's for this last situation, or for situations in which the president introduces forces into hostilities unlawfully, that the War Power Resolution provides for the oft-mentioned 48-hour report to Congress and 60-day timeline. If there's an attack in progress on the United States, we expect the president to respond swiftly to neutralize the attack and protect Americans, and then we will hold the president to account. The framers of the Constitution agreed at the debates in the Federal Convention of 1787 that the president should not have the power to repel sudden attacks, or should have the power to repel sudden attacks, but not the power to otherwise introduce forces into hostilities without congressional approval. I did an episode on this. I also pointed to the 10th Amendment Center, who lays this out historically. They go through all the documents. They do a wonderful job. Go check them out. I can't remember the episode, but I did the show on it. I linked to them. I even played a little clip. They did a wonderful job. The War Powers Resolution, Amash concludes here, does not confer any new authority on the president to take offensive military action without congressional approval, nor could it under our Constitution. It instead checks the president when, as the framers contemplated, the president introduces our armed forces into hostilities to repel a sudden attack. Okay? So for the purposes of this show, to be brief, he does not have the authority to just go attack other countries, which is what a lot of people said this was. Now, there's an argument out there, hey, this is not a war. Okay, let's put that to the test. Let's say for a moment that, let's say there was a 2020 election that was heavily contested, that allegedly was stolen. What would that make the sitting president? Illegitimate. And let's say there was a grievance that another country had with the United States that said, hey, you've been doing things that have harmed our country, whatever those things are, okay? And your president is partly guilty, and in fact, he's not even the real president. Hell, even you guys don't think he's the president. And so then they come in and they have an operation that kidnaps our president. Now, your first argument is probably inclined to be like, well, DL, that couldn't happen because we got a badass military. I get that. I'm not talking about the feasibility. I'm talking about just try to turn the table a little bit, enough to do a 180 and say, What if this were happening in our country under literally past circumstances that a lot of people said President Biden was not the legitimate president because they believed that the election was stolen by the Democrats, which would mean he is as illegitimate as we claim Maduro is. By our own words, would you see if they kidnapped President Biden and then said, yeah, we're running your country now, we'll tell you who gets to be the boss. We'll tell you who gets to be the new president later. Would anybody say, that's not an act of war, it was a surgical strike, they just came in and executed a warrant? Must be legit. Would they ever? No. Every single last one of those people would be howling from the rooftops. They would be calling international law. They would be citing everything that they are now ignoring. Every one of them. They would. Right? So for me, I look at it, I say, this is the reason why I look at it, I say, it's not legitimate. It's not legitimate because, number one, it doesn't fall into the War Powers Act or resolution. Number two, it definitely doesn't fall under the AUMF of 2001, or maybe it was 2002. But the AUMF does not cover it because it explicitly says related to 9/11. So that's not this. Nor has the Trump administration at any point made a case that it was. Okay? So once you have those two out, what's left? Well, can we just start executing warrants? Well, I would argue, no, we cannot. Not in this way. Now, could Venezuela have had a revolution, captured Maduro, put in whoever they thought was the legitimate president, and then delivered him to the U.S.? Perhaps. Okay? Because now the violation is on Venezuela. It's not on the U.S., right? So that's a different matter. And could they then try him in a U.S. court? I would arguably say that would be more appropriate, if not appropriate. Finally, a lot of people have made this argument. I've seen, because some people say, hey, we can't just go into a sovereign state and just start kidnapping people. And then a lot of rebuttals are like, they're not a sovereign state because he was illegitimate. Okay. Clearly you don't understand what a sovereign state is. A sovereign state is, this area is Venezuela. It's governed by Venezuelan law. It has Venezuelan people. It is distinct from its neighbors. That's all sovereign means. It does not mean that they necessarily have a legitimate government. It's not, like, because if that were the case, if it's true that the Democrats stole the election in 2020, then between 2020 and the end of 2024, 2025, we were not a sovereign nation. Is any MAGA person making that argument? The answer is no. We have to have consistency, and that is not consistent. So from my lay perspective, there was no legal grounds for the Trump administration to go and capture Maduro, which is why I frame it as being kidnapped. Okay? We just walked through. Now, if you have some other argument, I'd like to hear it, but these are the arguments that I have heard. Now, there is this legality debate, and my read as a regular citizen says this was illegal. So enter now in, what do we do about it? Right? Well, the courts have long upheld something called the Kerr-Frisbee Doctrine. That's basically where they allow the U.S. the prosecution of defendants even if the capture abroad was irregular. And they've got some cases that you can go back and look at, Noriega, Eichmann, etc. This provides domestic legal cover as long as Maduro receives due process in New York. Now, this is the funniest part of all, because he is granted due process, even though MAGA has been saying foreigners don't get due process. At least a lot of them, not all of them. Okay? So do you see how this web of inconsistency is playing out? Now, some critics have suggested that any citizen could sue, and by virtue, like I had an argument with somebody, and he was like, by virtue, yeah, Amash is making this argument, but is he suing, the government? And I kept trying to tell him, I was like, that's not how the system works. You don't just get to just sue the government because you say, hey, you did something I think is illegal. And the person came back to me, they're like, yeah, but it's taxpayer money. So no, that's not how it works. You have to have standing. Standing means you have to be directly affected by this. This is why the War Power Resolution, which has been repeatedly challenged, has repeatedly failed because of procedural issues. Okay? In other words, basically, you didn't follow the rules to get an audience with the courts. So therefore, they rejected it. They didn't reject it over substance of the argument. And it's funny because I've seen people say, well, they rejected it because the argument was no good. That would be an activist court. If the court said, this is not a good argument, we're not even going to let you come in and present it to us. That means they've decided before they've heard it. Because either the courts will look at a case and they will determine, do you have standing? And basically, are you following these procedural rules? And there's some other rules and stuff like that. I think there's some jurisdictional rules and whatnot. But basically, are you following the rules to get here? Okay, great. And then there is something that's called, what's it called? Give me a second. I will see if I can remember it. It's where they basically say you're likely to succeed, and then they allow the case to move forward. And so they look at the argument and they say, this looks like a strong argument, you're likely, and they'll allow you to move forward. But that's not the same. That's something different, and I don't have it at my fingertips. I don't have my notes or any notes at the fingertips to talk about why that's not applicable here, but you can go and look that up yourself. I encourage you to do it. But ultimately, I, as a U.S. citizen who pays my taxes, I do not have standing for the fact that it is a generalized grievance about government spending, foreign policy, and potential illegality. But that does not create, for me, a concrete, particularized injury. Like, I am not injured in that sense, in a very specific way, in different than, like, say, that Liberty Lady. Okay? It would be more generalized. So now you might ask, well, who has standing? Well, sometimes members of Congress, but that generally tends to fail unless it's a matter of vote nullification. So they voted on something and then the government went and did to the contrary. Then they could say, hey, we voted on this. This is what we approved. You violated our vote, right? You basically nullified our vote. Then members of Congress might have some standing. But even that gets a little tricky because it's like, okay, well, there's 535 members of Congress, and if only one of them claims to be harmed by this action, then what about the rest of them? So in that particular case, Congress as a whole, they could, or maybe one of the chambers could. So you could have the House Representatives. They could vote and say, we want our Speaker of the House to go and on our behalf as Congress as a whole, we want the Speaker of the House to go and file a lawsuit claiming that we have a grievance against the government for a violation, for not coming to us and getting permission first. In that case, it could go forward. Whether they would succeed or not is hardly something I could speak to at this point. But that's how it works. So there's really nothing that America could do. Do you see the problem that we have here with this? This is why I wanted to get to this particular part. Do you see the problem? The problem here is our entire system of governance was designed to be based on checks and balances and delegation of powers. Like, you get this power, you get this power. Congress has the power to declare war. The president has the power. The executive branch has the power to move troops. And they specifically separated those such that we can't misuse those powers so easily. Because Congress could declare war, but the president doesn't have to send troops. The president could send troops, but not be able to use them. Do you see how there's a check and balance there? Right? And if the president moves troops into a spot where they could be, now this is moving them. This is not actually engaging in any action. But if he moves troops to a particular location, then I would argue that the War Powers Act would come into play. Now he's got the 48 hours to notify Congress, hey, I've moved our troops. They're in a dangerous spot. They could, action could happen. And then he's got like the 60 to 90-day window to deal with that, right? I would argue that's when that window comes into play, okay? But as it stands, going and kidnapping somebody from another country appears to have virtually there's no check and balance on it. There's no good, meaningful check and balance. It's a very steep checks and balance because you would have to have the entirety of at least the whole chamber, if not the whole Congress, to agree, or maybe at least some supermajority agree. It's not very clear to me how much would be necessary because it's never happened. So in this particular sense, we're kind of like an uncharted territory in a sense, in terms of saying, hey, this was illegal, you can't do that. Now, then you can get into international law. Honestly, I don't care. I think we should honor our agreements internationally. The UN Secretary General and several Latin American leaders, they call it a violation of sovereignty, which I agree with. They also say it's a violation of the UN's charter, prohibition on force. In the U.S., their response is they're like, well, we don't recognize him as a head of state, so therefore he doesn't have the immunity under customary law, and so they frame this as basically just an arrest, right? I would argue that's bogus, that's garbage, but at the same time, I would also say I think we have enough domestically with our own laws to say you shouldn't have done this. I don't think we have to appeal to international. I think if we get to the point where we have to appeal to international law, then really the problem should be that it's other countries that are not cooperating, not that the U.S. is in violation. So in other words, we don't violate our own domestic laws, our own constitution, and then if we need to take action in some way or do something, and then some other country is not cooperating, then we could say, hey, this violates international law because we have made sure that we're at least first and foremost not violating our own laws and our own governing documents. So now the aftermath. What happens? Well, number one, Maduro could challenge this as Noriega tried to, and it's simply unlikely to go anywhere, right? They're going to, because he's just not going to have the standing because, they're going to rely on historical with the Noriega trial, and they're going to say he tried to make all these arguments too, and they failed, and so therefore yours are going to fail. So you might expect that to come about. I don't expect that to go anywhere, maybe make a few headlines, and that's it. But Maduro arrived in New York on January 3rd, and he's been detained in Brooklyn's MDC. He's facing the narco-terrorism charges, money laundering, and new terrorism financing charges that are tied to Tren de Aragua. Remember, Trump designated them as a terrorist organization. And then his wife, Celia Flores, she's going to be facing similar charges, and that trial is expected in late 2026. And so look forward to seeing how that plays out. My expectation is that he will be found guilty and he will go to jail, and that's that. As far as what happens to Venezuela, that is hard to say. Trump has stated that the U.S. will run Venezuela's transition. They will appoint a temporary administrator and deploy advisors and Marines for security and oil infrastructure protection. That is a whole nother conversation we can't get into because I'm short on time. But ultimately, I will just say this. I think the real reason that we went over there was for oil, and I don't think we really had that vested of an interest in dealing with narcotics. That was just what we used to get in there. Because if the government had said, well, we got to go over there and get this oil, then it would have failed. And Americans probably wouldn't have tolerated it in the first place. So they had to create some other reason to go in there, right? And the creation probably wasn't all that hard because, well, he was engaging in, narcotics dealing. And so, and then there is the connection of Tren de Aragua, right? But I would counter that and say, even though those things did exist, we could simply extract Tren de Aragua from our country, and we have better solutions for dealing with the drug war, rather than trying to go and shut it down, because at the end of the day, they were fulfilling a demand. And so somebody else is now going to fill that cocaine demand, period. That's it. Like, that's how it's always worked, right? I mean, we took out Noriega, and now we're dealing with Maduro, who in, 10, 20 years are we going to have to deal with next and say, oh, this guy's got, he's running drugs to the United States. So clearly it didn't work the first time. Why are we expecting it to work this time? Okay? So that's a rundown of what happened. And I tried to keep it as relatively objective as possible. Of course, I'm a talking head, so I've got to give you my opinion. My libertarian perspective says none of this was legitimate because we have no business invading another country. We have no business fighting a drug war because the drug war, unless there's a crime associated, a specific crime, like somebody breaks into your house to steal a TV so they can sell it for drug money, that is a crime. The fact that they want to do drugs or that they are so desperate for drugs that they actually create, that they actually go and commit a crime, that is a substance abuse problem. That is a medical problem, and it should be dealt with in the same way that we deal with alcoholism, right? We don't put people in jail for the pure fact that they had too much alcohol, like that they're carrying too much alcohol, right? Like, you bought too much alcohol from the store, we got to throw you in the slammer. It's not how it works. We also don't throw them in jail for using too much, right? For drinking too much. Now, if they drink too much and drive, that's a different story. That is considered a crime, right? Because now they've gotten behind the wheel. They're putting people at very direct threat. So I look at it and say the drug war has failed. We should get rid of it. We're not going to get rid of it because clearly that gives us an opportunity to go and commit regime changes, which is what we did. We are engaging in a regime change. This is morally wrong. In my opinion, it's also legally wrong, and we should have no part of it. And the American people, MAGA, they should be angry because Trump ran on, I'm not going to start new wars. Just because we can say, well, this was a surgical strike, it's not a whole war, that's because Venezuela hasn't responded. Now, are they likely to respond? Probably not. Maduro wasn't exactly a good guy. So a lot of Venezuelans are happy. I will point this out before we wrap this up. I will point out this one last comment. I saw a lot of people, they're like, oh, you don't care that Venezuelans are in tears and excited over this? And I'm like, I do care. I respect, I have Venezuelan friends. I have some that are here on asylum from Venezuela. And they are happy about this. And they should be. They should be skeptical because U.S. foreign intervention is like, there's a list of countries for which it has not turned out so well. So I think they should be skeptical of it. But in terms of just thinking like, hey, this Maduro guy is gone, yes, they should be excited about that. Should that be the determining factor of whether or not we support Trump? No, it should not. And here's where the MAGA supporters of this are being very inconsistent. Like barely a week ago, 2 weeks ago, you might have found some videos of people being deported, crying their eyes out. I'm just here trying to make a living. And what did MAGA do? They're like, I don't care about your tears. Get out. You don't belong here. The law is the law. Oh, okay. Well, if nobody's above the law, and the law is the law, as you say, then perhaps we apply that when our leader does something that's at the minimum questionable. It's at a minimum questionable. I mean, they had to spend several years laying the groundwork. And so now they can look back and say, well, we've framed this group as a terrorist organization. We declared that this guy wasn't the legitimate leader. We created an indictment for him. They had to do all these things over like 6 years before they could go and take him. What does that tell you? That tells you that they recognize there is some strain of lawfulness that they too have to follow. Now, we could argue whether or not they actually followed it and whether or not it was actually lawful, but we recognize that there has to be a lawful process in order to try a foreign national in our country. There is a lawful process. So no, their tears of joy are not going to motivate me any more than the tears of sadness for people that are being deported. I mean, they are going to motivate me. Don't get me wrong. That's not what I'm going to ultimately base my decision on. I'm going to base my decision on, is this legally correct and should we be doing it? And in many cases, just because something is legally correct doesn't necessarily mean you should be doing it, because sometimes the law is wrong. So there you have it, folks. That's my show for today. I hope you found it informative. I don't know if there's anything to be inspired. And whether you're watching me right now or you're watching me later, at some point in the future, drop a comment in. Let me know your thoughts. Did I miss something? Do I need to offer correction? Or maybe you just want to be promiscuous with praise and tell me, DL, you did such a great job. That's fantastic. I hope you do more of that. I'm all ears. But whatever the case is, with all that being said, I'm out. I will see you tomorrow. You know that I'm all about supporting organizations that hold my values. Make sure you head on over to blackgunsmatter.shop. They've got apparel, stickers, and more. Use the code LibertyDad, all one word, at checkout to score a 10% discount. Or just hit the referral link in the show notes. That'll make it so much easier. Remember, I'm not just a voice on a mic. I'm a dad who's working hard to deliver to you the best libertarian content. Connect with me on Linktree, where you'll find links to my Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee, because, you know, every bit helps keep this show rolling. Plus, you can find me on my other platforms to stay in the loop. With your help, this show, The Message of Liberty, will be seen and heard by more people. As always, I appreciate you tuning in and look forward to seeing you in the next episode.